In the 19th century, the British Empire fought two wars to force China to accept drug imports. They grew opium in India, processed it into smokable form, smuggled it into China through criminal networks, and used military force when China tried to stop it. This wasn't a secret operation by rogue agents. This was official government policy. The British Empire, the same one that preached civilization, Christianity, and commerce, was the world's largest drug trafficking operation. At its peak, opium sales accounted for 15 to 20% of British India's revenue. The trade was so valuable that Britain went to war twice rather than give it up. And when China tried to ban opium to save its population from addiction, Britain called it a violation of free trade and sent warships. This is the story of how the British Empire became the world's biggest narco-state, how they turned opium into a strategic weapon, and how one of history's most respectable empires built part of its wealth on industrialized drug trafficking. Because this isn't metaphor, the British Empire was literally a drug cartel, just one with warships, global reach, and the protection of international law. To understand why Britain became a narco-state, you need to understand the economic problem they faced with China. Britain was obsessed with Chinese goods, tea, silk, and porcelain. By the 1700s, tea had become essential to British culture. Millions of British citizens drank tea daily. It wasn't a luxury, it was a necessity. But China didn't want anything Britain produced. China was largely self-sufficient and had little interest in British manufactured goods. This created a massive trade imbalance. Britain bought huge amounts of Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain. China bought almost nothing from Britain. Britain had to pay everything in silver. The silver drain. Britain was hemorrhaging silver to China, millions of pounds worth annually. This was economically unsustainable. Britain's silver reserves were being depleted, and there was no way to balance the trade. China's position. The Qing dynasty controlled trade tightly. Foreign merchants could only trade through Canton, Guangzhou, under strict regulations, and only during specific seasons. China held all the power. Britain tried everything to balance the trade. Selling British manufactured goods, wool, metals, China wasn't interested. Offering other commodities, China didn't need them. Diplomatic missions asking for more open trade, China refused. By the early 1800s, Britain faced a choice: accept massive trade deficits with China or find something China wanted to buy. They found it: opium. Britain didn't just stumble into opium trafficking, they industrialized it. Step 1. Production in India. Britain controlled India through the East India Company and later directly. They forced Indian farmers in Bengal and other regions to grow opium poppies instead of food crops. The system: British authorities advanced money to farmers to grow opium. Farmers had to sell their opium harvest to the British at fixed prices. The British processed raw opium into smokable form in government factories. This was a government monopoly. Private production was illegal. Scale? By the 1830s and 1840s, India was producing thousands of tons of opium annually. This was industrial-scale drug manufacturing, government-run, highly organized, and incredibly profitable. Step 2. Smuggling in Canton, Guangzhou. Here's the clever part. The British East India Company didn't officially sell opium in China because opium was illegal there. The Qing dynasty had banned opium imports in 1729 and reiterated the ban multiple times. So Britain used a workaround. British ships brought opium to Chinese coastal waters, particularly around Canton and later Hong Kong, and anchored there. British merchants sold the opium to Chinese smugglers who distributed it throughout China. This created plausible deniability. The British government could claim they weren't directly selling opium in China, they were just selling it to Chinese merchants off the coast. What those merchants did with it wasn't Britain's responsibility.
But everyone knew what was happening. The Chinese government knew, the British government knew. It was organized drug smuggling with government backing. Step 3. Money laundering, the trade triangle. Here's how Britain solved their trade imbalance. British silver went to China to buy tea, silk, and porcelain. Chinese silver came back to Britain when Chinese bought opium from Indian production. The silver circulated instead of draining out of Britain. The triangle, Britain to silver to India, to opium to China, to silver back to Britain, to buy Chinese goods. Result? Britain could keep buying massive amounts of Chinese goods without depleting silver reserves. The opium trade balanced the books. Step 4. Massive profits. Opium was insanely profitable. Production cost in India very low, forced cultivation, low processing costs. Sale price in China extremely high, illegal product, addictive demand. Profit margins often 400 to 500% or more. By the 1830s, opium accounted for 15 to 20% of British India's government revenue. This was an enormous portion of colonial income, equivalent to tens of billions of dollars in today's money. Britain wasn't just balancing trade, they were making a fortune. By the 1830s, opium addiction was a crisis in China. Estimates suggest 12 million Chinese were opium addicts, about 3% of the population. In some regions, addiction rates reached 20 to 30%. The social impact was catastrophic. Productivity collapsed as workers became addicts. Silver was flowing out of China to buy opium, reversing the earlier flow. The military was weakened. Soldiers were addicted. Government officials were corrupted by smuggling profits. In 1839, the Qing emperor decided to act. Commissioner Lin Zexu was appointed to stop the opium trade. He was aggressive. He confiscated and destroyed 20,000 chests of opium, about 1,400 tons, worth millions. He blockaded British merchants in Canton. He demanded Britain stop the opium trade entirely. Britain's response? War. The First Opium War, 1839 to 1842. Britain sent a naval expedition to China. British warships bombarded Chinese cities. British forces easily defeated Qing armies. China's military technology was a century behind Europe's. Why Britain went to war? Officially, protection of British merchants and free trade. Actually, forcing China to accept opium imports. The Treaty of Nanking, China's humiliation. China was forced to pay $21 million in reparations to Britain, an enormous sum. Cede Hong Kong Island to Britain permanently. Open 5 ports to British trade, not just Canton. Limit tariffs on British goods to 5%. Grant British citizens extraterritoriality. Chinese law didn't apply to them. Notably, the treaty didn't explicitly legalize opium, but it opened ports and weakened Chinese control, making smuggling easier. The Second Opium War, 1856 to 1860. Britain, now joined by France, wanted even more. Legal opium trade, not just smuggling. More ports opened. Foreign diplomats in Beijing. Missionaries allowed throughout China. China resisted. Britain and France invaded again. The result?
British and French troops sacked and burned the old Summer Palace in Beijing, a UNESCO-level cultural site. China forced to sign the Treaty of Tientsin in 1858 and Convention of Peking in 1860. Opium trade was legalized. 10 more ports opened. Foreign control over Chinese customs revenue. Kowloon Peninsula ceded to Britain, expanding Hong Kong. The pattern is clear. Britain fought 2 wars to force China to accept drug imports. They used military power to keep the opium trade flowing. Let's put the scale of this drug trafficking operation in perspective. Volume. By the 1880s, thousands of tons of opium were being imported into China annually. Some estimates suggest 6,500 plus tons per year at peak. Addicts. By 1900, Estimates of Chinese opium addicts ranged from 15 to 20 million people, over 10% of the adult male population in some regions. Revenue. Opium sales were 15 to 20% of British India's government revenue from the 1820s to 1880s. This was the second largest revenue source after land taxes. In today's terms, this would be equivalent to a government earning tens of billions annually from drug sales. Comparison to modern drug cartels. At their peak, the Medellin cartel under Pablo Escobar was making $21 to $22 billion in 1980s-90s dollars from cocaine. The British opium trade, adjusted for inflation and scale, was similar or larger, and it lasted for over a century, not just a decade or two. But here's the key difference. Modern cartels operate outside the law. The British opium trade was backed by law, protected by treaties, and enforced by military power. Pablo Escobar was hunted by governments. The British opium traders were protected by the British government. The moral justification, free trade. British politicians and merchants justify the opium trade as freedom of commerce. They argued China had no right to ban a product that people wanted to buy. This is the same argument drug cartels use. We're just providing what people want. If there's demand, prohibition doesn't work. The difference is that Britain had the military and diplomatic power to enforce this argument with violence. When did it end? The opium trade continued legally until the early 1900s. International pressure, ironically including from the United States, which would later fight its own wars related to drug policy, eventually led to international agreements limiting opium trade. The International Opium Convention in 1912 started the process of restricting opium trade. But British involvement in opium trafficking only fully ended after World War I as the empire began to decline. Total duration, over 100 years of government-backed drug trafficking. So what do we learn from Britain's century as a narco-state? Lesson 1. Empires prioritize profit over morality consistently. The British Empire presented itself as a civilizing force, bringing Christianity, law, and commerce to the world. Meanwhile, they were running the world's largest drug trafficking operation and using military force to keep it going. This isn't hypocrisy, it's how empires work. Moral justifications are for public consumption. Actual policy is determined by profit and power. Lesson 2. Free trade can be a weapon, not just a principle. Britain's argument, China shouldn't ban products people want to buy, sounds like principled free market economics, but it was cynically applied. Britain forced China to accept opium while maintaining strict tariffs and trade restrictions protecting British industries at home. Free trade meant free for us to sell you drugs, not actual reciprocal freedom. Modern parallel. Developed countries preach free trade to developing countries while protecting their own agriculture, industries, and services through subsidies and regulations. Lesson 3. Military power determines what's legal internationally. The opium trade was illegal in China. China tried to enforce their laws. Britain said no and sent warships. The result, China's laws didn't matter. British military power decided what was legal in Chinese ports. This is how international law actually works. It's enforced by those with the power to enforce it, not by abstract principles of right and wrong. Lesson 4. Drug policy is always about power and economics, not just public health. Britain forced opium on China when it was profitable. Later, Britain and the U.S. led international efforts to ban opium when it no longer served their interests. Modern drug policy follows the same pattern. Laws about which drugs are legal or illegal don't follow consistent principles about harm or addiction. They follow political and economic interests. Lesson 5. History gets sanitized.
Ask most people about the British Empire, and they'll mention railways, democracy, the English language. Few know about the industrial-scale drug trafficking, the wars fought to protect drug trade, and the millions of Chinese addicts. Empires control how their history is remembered. The ugly parts get minimized or forgotten. The supposedly noble parts get emphasized. The question this raises, if the British Empire, often held up as relatively civilized compared to other empires, was running a narco-state for a century, what does that tell us about other empires, about how nations actually behave when profit is on the line? The British Empire forced India to grow opium, smuggled it into China through criminal networks, fought 2 wars when China tried to stop it, and made 15 to 20% of colonial India's revenue from drug trafficking for over a century. This wasn't a scandal or a corruption case, it was official policy. The world's most powerful empire was the world's biggest drug cartel, complete with industrial production, international smuggling networks, and military enforcement. And they justified it with free trade and civilization. If this changed how you think about empire, trade, and how history gets sanitized, hit subscribe. Drop a comment. Did you know the British Empire fought wars to sell drugs? And share this with someone who needs to understand that empires don't follow the moral rules they preach. Because understanding that one of history's most respectable empires was built partly on drug trafficking reveals something fundamental. Power determines morality, not the other way around. And the respectable story is written by the winners. I'll see you in the next one.